Thank you for attending Cannabis on the Ballot, Lessons Learned from the Marijuana Reform Movement, hosted by the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center at The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law. Before we begin, we have just a few notes we'd like to share with you. First, to streamline the appearance of the webinar, we suggest that you hide non-video participants. Second, we want to draw your attention to the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. You may submit questions at any time. Please note, however, that there is limited time available for Q&A at the end of the session. Third, closed captioning has been enabled for this event. To change how you view the transcription or to hide it, click Live Transcript in the menu at the bottom of your Zoom window. Finally, this event is being recorded. The recording will be made available on the event page and social media channels as soon as possible after the event. Follow us at OSU Law DEPC to stay up to date on our research, programming, and future events. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the event. Doug?
Thank you so much, Holly, and thanks to everybody at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, all the staff for helping us get this webinar going, and thank you to all of you attending. Very exciting to talk about this topic. As some of you may have heard, there is apparently an election taking place that will culminate in a couple weeks, and remarkably, this seems to be the 10th or 12th consecutive election that's the most important of our lifetimes. But jokes aside about the significance of each cycle, I think anybody who follows cannabis reform, drug policy reform more generally, kind of really understands how the last few elections have had that much more significance because of the momentum that's been moving forward, particularly with cannabis legalization, but really a range of drug policy topics. And it's been something that we've been excited to follow at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center. You may have seen on the slides before we got started that we've got a Drugs on the Ballot 2022 webpage that has a number of graphics and other materials that have been put together by the DEPC staff to, again, kind of contextualize what we're talking about here today. Today, we're talking about kind of lessons learned from the way in which the cannabis reform movement, marijuana reform, has used direct democracy, used the opportunity to go straight to the voters to drive forward reform campaigns. And I'm extraordinarily excited. We have three panelists who have thought about these issues, written about these issues, worked on these issues for a number of years. And just very grateful to have Tamar Todd, Daniel Ornstein, and Burrel Vann Jr. With us to sort of share their perspectives. The game plan here has to have each of them individually give a short presentation, their perspective, talk about their own roles in studying and being a part of the ballot initiatives that have gotten us to this moment, and then particularly focus on what 2022 has to offer, what we can look forward to both in this election cycle and perhaps future ones. And then we'll have some time for questions. Please use the Q&A to suggest questions. I've got a few already ready for them, but we really like this to be a dialogue with all of you who are attending, because there's so many aspects of this issue that merits attention. I'm sure we can't cover it all in the roughly 70 minutes we have together, but again, I'm extraordinarily excited to have such a great group to talk about it. We're going to start with Tamar Todd. She's the legal director at New Approaches PAC and a lecturer at Berkeley Law. I just do this sort of short form introduction because I want each of the panelists to sort of talk about their role, their background in looking at these issues, and then share their perspectives on their own before we get into a little bit of a dialogue. And so without further ado or further introduction, Tamar, if you'd come on and tell us a little bit about what you've been up to and what you think about all this.
Okay, great. Well, here I am. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here, and I'm excited about this panel because I have spent my entire career basically working on direct democracy and marijuana law reform. Before I worked at New Approach PAC, I worked for an organization called the Drug Policy Alliance that does broad drug policy reform, including cannabis law reform. And so I spent about 15 years working both on state legislation and state ballot initiatives on drug policy and marijuana more specifically. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the role that direct democracy has played in marijuana law reform, and then also what I see as some of the pros and the cons of that approach. First of all, in terms of the most consequential elections of our time, I would say for marijuana, the most consequential election was in 1996 when California used the ballot initiative process to legalize medical cannabis in the state. And I say that because while, I personally have actually conflicting feelings as a citizen about the use of direct democracy, because I see it being used for a lot of good and sometimes bad. And as a voter in California, I live in California, and as a voter here, I open up my ballot every election cycle and find myself voting on everything from like the appropriate square footage for chickens to have outdoor space to be considered free range, to spending $1 billion on a high-speed rail, to all these budget questions, taxation questions, and often think, is this the best way to make policy? Am I informed enough as a voter to make these complicated budgetary decisions, and who funded this initiative and who put it on the ballot and who stands to benefit? So all these questions. But in the context of marijuana, I truly believe that but for direct democracy, we would not have a single state in the United States that had legalized even medical cannabis under state law, much less legalization of broader cannabis. And that would not have, we wouldn't have had the cannabis law reform movement that then led to internationally change, Canada legalizing cannabis, a reconsideration of its status around the world. And that's because I think public opinion on this issue long was far apart from elected officials. And it wasn't the type, and it still isn't the type of issue that I think you really have single issue voters on, where an elected official is going to win or lose their race based on what someone thinks about cannabis. So it's very easy for a long time for elected officials to not take action on medical cannabis or cannabis legalization, despite what their voters wanted, because that didn't even rate in maybe the top 8 or 10 issues that voters would consider them on. So it wasn't until voters drafted their own law, brought it directly to the ballot, and the voters could directly vote on it, that they could make the states change the law. They could force the change and then force the change on that implementation. And then other voters in other states saw that, and it repeated itself. So I think but for direct democracy and access to the ballot, we wouldn't have had basically any marijuana law reform of this modern era. At the same time, I think, and I wrote about this in a paper last year, I think the success of marijuana at the ballot has actually led to some changes in the ballot initiative process itself. And we saw in the last election cycle, now that marijuana law reform has moved to particularly some much more conservative states where the voters are on board, but there's a lot more entrenched hostility among state lawmakers and state Supreme Courts, we actually saw some backlash to that success, where we had ballot initiatives that were either going to be successful in the ballot and attempting to get on the ballot, or actually passed in South Dakota and Mississippi, and vying for the ballot in Nebraska, where we saw the state Supreme Court actually step in and really substantially restrict the entire ballot initiative direct democracy process as a reaction to the success of marijuana. And even in Mississippi, eliminated the process entirely from the Constitution. Some of that may be a result of those initiatives being constitutional amendments and an extra layer of protection and concern around amending a state constitution for marijuana. But we did see that sort of backlash. And we've also seen a reaction legislatively in a number of states where state legislatures have continually tried to make it more difficult to access the ballot by requiring an increased number of signatures, challenging, even to bordering on the ridiculous, like your petitions have to be printed in 14-point font and on one sheet of paper, and very complicated schemes to just try and make access to the ballot more difficult. So, you see the flip where sometimes it's not necessarily one political ideology that uses access to the ballot. So you see pushback from that sort of actually along both sides of the political spectrum. But in this recent era, there's certainly been, because of the success of marijuana, a reaction in that way. So I want to talk quickly about what I see some of the pros and the cons of going directly to the people, because I think that has shaped what at least the first wave of marijuana law reform laws looked like, and what policies they actually held. And I think a lot of that was a result of them being adopted through direct democracy. And then we see some departure and some changes now that it's become popular enough that some states without ballot initiative processes are adopting it legislatively. And we see significant changes there. So as I said already, some of the pros of going directly to the people through ballot initiative and why marijuana took this route was that you get to sidestep legislative politics. Like sometimes the legislature just won't act, even if you have very, very broad public support because of other special interests, other lobbying, just no one wanting to put themselves out on this issue. So you get to sidestep the legislature. The people can draft their own legislation and vote on it and adopt the policy. It's not as beholden in some ways to the special interests and lobbyists that legislation takes place. So you could have it's a little idealistic in terms of how it actually plays out, but it's an idea of the people vote directly on it. And while lawmakers are beholden to special interests and lobbyists who pay them a lot of money, direct democracy doesn't have that in the same way. However, some of the cons of direct democracy is that it's still funded by people with particular interests. Often the first wave of cannabis legalization was philanthropic. So it was focused on people who are wanting to change the criminal laws and change policy. But cannabis, like other issues, now sometimes can be funded by folks who are hoping to have a special interest to profit by the new industry, and the initiatives will be shaped and drafted to reflect that. You also don't benefit from the legislative process. So there's not open hearings where experts come and share information about what would make the law better or what is not workable. And you can also lock in bad policy. A lot of ballot initiatives, if you do a constitutional initiative, or in California, even just the statutory initiative, it can be fixed in place so the legislature cannot change it. So that can be useful if you're in a very conservative state on marijuana policy and you don't want the legislature repealing the law or changing it. But it can also, you get farther down the road and you realize things you want to change and improve upon, and some of that policy can be locked in. One example is like the death penalty in California, where the legislature and the governor would certainly repeal the death penalty in California, but it's locked into place through initiative. So it would have to be repealed through a ballot initiative. They can be hard to implement. The first wave of cannabis law reform, certainly we're in states where the people said you have to do it, and then the state agencies and the government didn't want to implement it. So you have to draft it with your eye on that. And then finally, and then I'll stop so others can have time to speak. I think the biggest sort of limitation in going this route, although I don't think there were other opportunities, at least initially, to start it, is that you have to be fairly conservative in the policy you put forward, right? So you have to convince 50+1% of the people to vote on it. You have to guard against any political attacks, opposition, upsetting well-funded entities that would act or against it. And so you have to be very conservative in the drafting. So something like retroactivity, which now is very broadly popular and is included in both state ballot initiatives, retroactivity and expungement of criminal law changes, in ballot initiatives and legislation is one of the most popular components. 10 years ago, it wasn't. When you polled on this issue in Colorado and Washington, that was something that was not popular and could potentially bring the initiative down. So pieces like that, you basically have to include what the majority wants, which isn't necessarily the best way to protect certain minority rights. Similarly, with tax revenue, it goes where the people want it to go, to education or to these broader, very popular political buckets, rather than necessarily focused on undoing the harms of marijuana prohibition and giving money and investing in communities that were most harmed. Can be difficult through the ballot initiative process. So I want to stop there, and I'll answer more questions about what's on the ballot as that comes up, but those are my initial thoughts, and I'll hand it back to you, Doug.
Thank you so much, Tamar, and especially that sort of last point of how just a decade ago, it was thought you had to keep some of the social justice and criminal justice reforms off the initiative so that you'd get to 50+1. And now it seems, or at least I've seen some, reporting out of Missouri and Arkansas where it's on the ballot this year, that it may be the lack of those kinds of provisions may be leading to opposition, or at least providing a stumbling block to getting to 50+1. And so that's a really interesting point, and one that maybe we'll follow up when we get to the Q&A. But first, I want to make sure we get our other speakers their time. Daniel Ornstein, who's now serving as an independent researcher, but has written a lot on this topic in a variety of different roles, and has really brought some important perspectives to the way we think about cannabis reform generally, and then particularly at the ballot initiative process as it interacts with good policy here. So thank you, Daniel, for joining us. And the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. And good morning from the West, and good afternoon to all of those of you in the East. I think it sounds like all of us are out West from the panelists, though. I'm in Arizona right now, so we're also dealing with our ballot initiatives and the upcoming election. So let me just start. I want to jump off right from Tamar's last point, because I think that was one that I was going to talk about anyway, too, which is some of the conservative drafting initially that leads to a lot of unsolved problems that remain in some of these initiatives, particularly in some older ones. A couple more that I want to harp on here for a second are public consumption and social equity, which both go to some similar issues in my mind, which is fairness and undoing some of the embedded inequities of the war on drugs. So the social equity programs, Tamara already touched on a little bit. These were rarely part of the earlier initiatives. Now, as Doug mentioned, they're becoming almost an essential part if you want to pass an initiative now. But what tends to happen, as I see it here, is a disconnect then, at least in those earlier initiatives, between the rhetoric about undoing the harms and fixing, the system versus what actually happens, which is, we end up with some fairly concentrated, marijuana businesses run by and primarily profiting people who, look like me, who were not those who were predominantly harmed by the war on drugs. Public consumption, I actually see in a very similar light, and I've written about this a couple of times, which is, there's a tendency in the ballot initiatives to have flatly prohibited any kind of public consumption of marijuana, and I think that makes perfect political sense. Most of these would never have passed in the era that they were, put forward. If they had said, we're also going to allow people to consume these products somewhere in public, it would have been, roundly criticized by lots of people in the space, saying, "Oh, you're just going to have people smoking joints on the sidewalk everywhere." But this tends to just kick a significant problem down the road if you don't address it. You just say, well, people will use it in their own homes. Well, not everybody gets a chance to own private property, and those divisions in among people are not equitably distributed across the population. So essentially what you do is you have legalized consumption for richer people. So that I see as a significant problem that's also related to the other point where I think Tamara and I are in, complete agreement here about some of the pluses and minuses about using ballot initiatives, which is, one thing that's a problem is they're very difficult to change. Even when you realize there's a problem, depending on how your state law is set up, it can be very, very hard for a legislature to go back in and make, edits. Even if they're broadly popular, even if they're clearly required, it can, in some states, Arizona is probably the most difficult example. It can be very, very hard to make changes to a ballot initiative without a new ballot initiative, which means someone has to fund it, someone has to, go forward and argue with it, and it has to pass. So, some definitions here, how do these laws deal with DUIs? How do they deal with the weight of non-plant products in things like edibles? Changes in tax rates or other calculations if they aren't, pegged to inflation or things like that. Initiatives are static. And at least ideally, a legislature is more nimble and able to sort of deal with these issues as they arise. Agencies can do this too if the initiative appropriately empowers them to do it. But there's a limit to just how much you can pack into one of these initiatives. So I'll give you an example of how much you can pack in, though. I'm not usually one for props, but I happen to have received my Arizona ballot voting guide fairly recently with the election upcoming. There are 11 separate ballot measures on this, and they consume 260 pages of text in here of information. I don't know how, well most people are going to be able to even have time to read that, let alone internalize the very complicated stuff that's happening there. So it's a messy way to make law. It's by necessity for a lot of this. Again, Tamara really got us off to a heck of a start here. totally agree. You know, a lot of this would not have happened but for the ballot initiative process. Legislatures wouldn't touch this with a 10-foot pole, and a lot still won't, even though opinions have generally changed. One other problem here, you know, to change points here. My main focus as a researcher is public health law and policy. And this is something that has just not been well represented in the initiatives. And, you know, my thinking here is that this is, you know, a key time to learn from tobacco and alcohol and other substances that we regulate and how badly we tend to regulate them, and try to fix that with marijuana regulation, and then to use that to fix some of these other regimes. But key public health priorities are typically not reflected in ballot initiative legislation. There's a couple of reasons for this. One is, you know, public health isn't sexy. You know, when it's working, you don't notice it. It's also tends to be contrary to some business interests, and that, you know, someone has to pay for the initiatives to go forward. While some of the early ones were more philanthropic, business interests have become a little bit more involved in later initiatives. And it's partly public health's own fault. You know, I don't want to let us off the hook. I think one of the biggest problems is that public health as a field has not taken a clear position on these issues. And so we don't get involved in the process. If it goes through the legislature, we get called as experts. That'll work. But, you know, when it comes to the initiatives, we tend to just bow out. Some of that's because you know, a lot of public health is state and federal agencies, and they're explicitly prohibited from taking positions on these things. But it's damaging, I think, to trying to get this right. And then when you combine it with how hard it is to change, you end up really ignoring what I think are essential issues in this space that we need to get right. I'm not usually in agreement with any of the sort of more prohibitionist type of organizations, but one thing that some of them have gotten right is that there is a significant risk of creating the new tobacco industry here, or the new alcohol industry here. And that's worrisome, or it should be. If you're not worried about that, let's talk. I can make you worried about that. But you know, so let me leave it there, and so we can move on, and we'll pick up some of it, I'm sure, in further discussion.
I really appreciate that, Daniel. And you know, this issue, and this is why, again, I find this so fascinating, you know, where we've seen some social justice issues go from being unspeakable in this context as you're trying to get the campaign to the finish line, to where they're now more integral to the conversation and more fundamental to even the political effort to get this on the ballot. In the public health sphere, I don't think we've seen that same transition. I think, as you mentioned, you know, both, you know, who funds this and you know, the nature of the issue can tend to keep it from getting as much attention, though I think that's evolving as well. And I definitely think we're at least in sort of the conversation among elected officials, more of a lean into public health issues in this space, for good or for bad. And you probably would say both at times. And so again, appreciate all your comments. And then absolutely not least, but last for our opening presentations, we're going to turn to Dr. Burrel Vann Jr., who's an assistant professor of criminal justice at the School of Public Affairs at San Diego State University. And from him, I'm extraordinarily grateful that he also woke up early from the West Coast and is going to share his thoughts on a topic I know he's been doing some research and broader thinking about. And so now, Burrel, the floor is yours.
Awesome. So again, thank you for having me here. Yes, it is early. This is probably the earliest I've woken up in a while, but I'm happy to be here and be in conversation with Dan and Tamara here. So I come to the study of marijuana and cannabis legalization kind of as a noob. I come from a sociologist background, which means I'm super interested in environments and the context and how those things play a role in public opinion or support for things. So I'm super interested in things like contentious politics and activist organizations, advocacy organizations, and their effect on public opinion. And this has led me down this route. You know, I still kind of feel like a noob in this realm, but I've been studying things like the effect of social structure, and so like crime and segregation and how those things play a role on people's opinions about whether or not we should legalize, right? In recent years, I spent a little bit more time focusing on the effects of direct democracy, and more importantly, variability in direct democracy across states and how that shapes the probability of success for any kind of initiative, let alone legalization of cannabis, right? So some of my more recent work has sort of taken to task our understanding of what direct democracy looks like, how we've been treating it in research, and understanding that states are doing very different things when it comes to the issue of direct democracy. So while in some states we might think that once an initiative has been voted on and been supported by the public, it's sort of done, right? But in some states, the legislature does have a lot of say or power to sort of revoke the things that have been voted on by the public. So I was in one of my more recent articles, I was sort of trying to unpack that and understand how the power of voters sort of contends with the power of the legislature in a state and sort of can inhibit or bolster the likelihood of success on these issues. So while I do agree that in most places, you know, legalization, once it's voted on, can't change, there are ways that things can be changed. And usually we tend to find these higher likelihood of, you know, the legislature coming in and stepping in and saying, you know, we want to alter the initiative after the fact. It's happening a lot of times in more conservative spaces, but it's not always the case. Right? So I'm interested in how these rules about direct democracy affect the likelihood of success. But in more recent years, I'm kind of to both Daniel's and Tamar's point, I've been more interested in the way we talk about these things, right? So I have, you know, a line of inquiry that's, sorry, I'm talking a lot about research. I come from the research space. So this is, you know, how I've delved into this legalization of cannabis space. But in recent years, I've spent a lot of time thinking about and researching how we talk about the issue of cannabis in the public and on ballot initiatives. So some of my recent work, which is going to be out soon, looks at the framing or narratives surrounding legalization, like how we talk about it. Are we still talking about marijuana, cannabis legalization in terms of like criminality? Are we talking about communities of color? Are we talking about over policing? Are we talking about liberties and freedoms and rights and things like that? And how those discourses around the issue have evolved over time. You know, sometimes we're engaging more with the rights kind of narrative. Sometimes we're engaging more, especially in 2020, 2021, we're engaging more with a policing in communities of color kind of narrative, and how those shifts ultimately lend themselves to increased or decreased support of marijuana legalization over time. So that's one sort of trajectory, but I've also realized the ways in which the ballot initiatives themselves have shifted in the way that we're talking about garnering support, right? So like think back to the initiatives in Colorado and Oregon and Washington, and it was super explicit about establishing regulatory boards and the tax rate and all of the economic benefits that would result from legalization, right? And in recent years, we've seen a shift, right? There was an opportunity in the late 2010s late 2010s to reframe marijuana legalization as a way to help communities of color. And beyond that, in recent years, we've seen a shift away from those narratives explicitly being put in legalization initiatives, and we've seen, especially like where is it, in Arkansas and Missouri, the way that the issue is being framed is not necessarily helping communities of color, but ways of helping police or veterans, or sort of like a more conservative sort of stance on the issue, but it's framing it for the community. So we're seeing that voters and organizations are realizing the importance of the framing around the issue, but also that they're realizing the importance, but that this is a shift from how it's been traditionally framed, and it may, sort of play more appropriately for those communities. So I'm interested more broadly in those kinds of topics. And I think it's interesting that Tamar brought up the issue of essentially framing, right? Because it makes me think back about the good and bad of the ballot initiative. Here in California, what was it, 2020, we had an initiative on basically free reign for Uber and Lyft. And the way that it was framed was super confusing, but gave complete autonomy and power to those companies. So while I do see like the benefits of direct democratic processes, I do see the harm that they can have on communities, right? So yeah, I'm gonna stop talking, but I'm super interested in establishing a discussion about discourse and discursive effects around these issues, because I think that's where I'm going in terms of these issues, and I think that discourse is going to play a super important role. And like you're looking at campaign ads for, like here in California, we have Prop 26, Prop 27, talking about gambling and things like that, and they're framed in super different ways, which might have effects on who is supporting and who sees opposition for these things. So, okay, I'm gonna stop rambling.
It's very insightful rambling. I'm going to ask all of our panelists to turn their cameras on so that we can start a sort of broader discussion of these issues, because I think that sort of sets it up nicely, and actually it somewhat leads into kind of my first question. All three of you presented in wonderful ways just sort of the broader fabric of how we think about ballot initiatives fitting into this particular policy space, and the pros and cons and lessons learned, as the title of the webinar was meant to highlight. But now I'd love to drill us into maybe a little bit more into what we're seeing here in 2022, both in terms of what's different, what we're noticing. We talked a little bit about this, perhaps about social justice playing a bigger role, but I think that's particularly interesting against the backdrop of the fact that I think this is the reddest state round of initiative efforts, right? That but for Maryland, where it was the legislature had to put it on the ballot because that's how their system works. All the other states that are going to be voting on full legalization initiatives are pretty red states, and that not only leads me to be interested to see what the outcome is, but also whether have people noticed if the messaging is different. I sense there's been maybe more litigation than usual about just getting to the ballot this cycle. I certainly have seen some reports about some of the provisions being a little bit different. I'd be eager to hear kind of any perspectives on maybe what you've noticed, or at least maybe what we ought to be looking for this cycle. One of the, I think, hallmarks of why this effort for cannabis reform generally, for the ballot initiative approach in particular, has been so successful is there have been very few losses, or at least very few sort of notable losses. Ohio, where I'm working from, had I think a loss that was largely celebrated by everybody, because Daniel, your comments about being concerned about kind of a corporatization takeover was in full force with that effort here in Ohio in 2015, and that was also awfully early in the cycle to be moving forward in a fairly red state that Ohio's become. But curious for your take on, is there a particular state you're watching? Is there a particular provision, or is it just part of this ongoing trend? But there'll be particular things to say about where we are. And I'll kind of wrap in one piece of one of the Q&A questions I noticed, which is I sense there was a while when at least some people would advocate for putting marijuana on the ballot as a way to drive turnout among younger voters, as a way to possibly kind of move the margin a little bit in a swing environment. That may be hard if you're running in non-swing states, but it also just sort of curious about whether your sense is we're now only talking about cannabis reform with these initiatives rather than kind of the way in which that issue integrates with other political conversations, even though, again, in my sense is this is the cycle in which we've seen more, at least Democrats, kind of vocally supportive of cannabis reform more generally. And so that was about a 17-part question, but pick whatever part interests you and jump in and share some thoughts about what we're going to learn in 2022 in a couple of weeks.
Well, I'll jump then. Yeah, Ohio was the outlier on that unusual loss, but probably a good thing. Definitely a corporatization and the wrong cycle timing as well. But aside from that, I do think yeah, there have been very, very few losses. This cycle, interestingly, could be different, in part because of which states and the general political environment. I'm not really sure what's going to happen in a couple of these states. I think a few of them will pass. I think Maryland's will pass handily. I don't have a good sense for Missouri or Arkansas. It seems like the polling is a little all over the place, and who knows? But I think some of that is just a function that the politics of this are strange now. It used to be seen as more of a left issue, with some libertarians, involved, but it's not so much anymore, with the exception that this is the first time I can really identify that you do see the politicians running for high state office openly supporting or opposing, but openly supporting these ballot initiatives in any place. There may have been a few scattered in Tamar or Burrel might know better than me on some of that, but normally you wouldn't see somebody running for governor say, yes, I support marijuana legalization. I think that's new, and that's really interesting to me.
I'll jump in with a couple comments. First of all, just circling back to Ohio in 2015. I actually think that initiative was critical. It lost, and obviously it was, and for the students who don't know, it created an oligopoly in the Ohio Constitution that would have given the 10 funders complete control over all production within the state. Each of the 10 funders contributed $2 million to fund the initiative. But that initiative, I view as being what changed the conversation around equity in the initiatives, that it shocked people, like when they saw that. So before that, we were drafting the initiatives thinking like, can we actually do this? Like, is the federal government going to allow this to happen? Like, we want to change these criminal penalties, and oh yeah, we need some sort of licensing system. So we'll give that to the state to figure out. And then that Ohio initiative came across, and I feel like everyone said, holy smokes, like, I don't even support this legalization initiative. And like, I've been working on legalization my entire life. And wait, who is going to get all the money from this new industry? And like, that's not fair. And so it really was pivotal in changing the conversation around it, I think. And suddenly everyone was saying like, oh no, I only support a certain kind of legalization initiative, and it has to meet these other elements. So I actually view that as very important. And then the initiatives this cycle, yeah, it's North Dakota, South Dakota, Arkansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma is going to be on the ballot in March. So I don't think you get redder than that. But those states are looking to legalize marijuana, and the initiatives are on the ballot because the majority of voters in those states, when asked, support it. And I think one thing I'll say about sort of the dialogue and conversation, and actually if you dig into some of those initiatives, particularly Missouri and Oklahoma, they include pretty aggressive reforms in some areas. Missouri, I would argue, has the most aggressive retroactivity expungement provision of any initiative going forward so far. But the way they're framed in the conversation about them in those states, like their marijuana is a bipartisan issue in those states. The voters that make up, in Oklahoma, 70% of the voters are Republicans. So when you have a majority support for initiative, you're built a coalition that is really strongly bipartisan. And you see that in the reflection of the conversation among electeds and who's going to come out aggressively against it or not. And so they're proceeding, and I think they need to proceed in a way that doesn't get polarized and fall into how everything else is partisan and political, and you don't even know why some things fall on one side of the partisan thing and others, like why are masks like this and the other. I mean, like, it doesn't even make sense, but once something becomes polarized and people like are in their different camps about it, then so there's now broad support and consensus across party line. It's very bipartisan, the support for the initiatives in those states. And I think the framing and the conversation around it is going to try and hold that together, because it's one of very, very few issues right now that hasn't broken down completely into this partisan line. And so the messages are slightly different, but I think they're reflecting sort of walking that line about trying to hold together a coalition that doesn't normally exist of voters, but who all support this kind of reform.
Yeah, it's interesting that in places like Arkansas and Missouri, like, I don't know if we've seen a trajectory towards like a freedom and civil liberties kind of argument explicitly in the ballot initiatives, but looking closer at Arkansas and Missouri, like, it was funny looking at the initiatives themselves, because it's like, this is for supporting and funding the police. So it's like, whoa, you go to any community in California and we're talking about marijuana legalization. That's not how we're framing it. It's like social justice kind of framing and communities of color. So it's interesting to see that they know, I mean, obviously they know who their audience is, and we have to walk this line. But like, I think the interesting shift for me that I've seen in recent years is like the ideological similarity, right? Where we're seeing more right-leaning places start taking up this issue, and other right-leaning, maybe not neighboring states, but other right-leaning places are also saying, yeah, like, it worked in those places. How can we get it to work in our state, right? And I think for me, the framing is the big part. Like, Missouri is framing it as like a PTSD and veterans kind of issue. It's like, and that makes complete sense. So it's some of my earlier arguments, like when I was back doing my dissertation work on this stuff, was like, okay, we have to be sort of constricted in the types of arguments that we're making, because there's not broad-based support. But what, 3, 4, 5 years later, we're talking about broad arguments to garner support in certain places, right? And it makes sense when you can speak to things like the liberty effects beyond like the economic benefits of legalization. Now you're really hitting home for these people. I think it's interesting that South Dakota is still trying and trying and trying. It's been so long that I haven't read much about South Dakota, but I didn't see, at least at initial pass, anything about a regulatory board in the initiative, which is super interesting. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's super interesting to see that, you know, some of the most successful places have, like, we're establishing this board, or the liquor and tobacco board is going to take control of taxation and things like that. So if it's not the case for South Dakota, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if they're also not going to be successful again.
But, you know, all those comments are so interesting, and it's again another layer of where kind of the move to red state environments is so interesting. Not just that we're seeing the proposals come together differently and the campaigns come together differently, but some of the topics that we've talked about earlier, you know, concern about kind of corporatization, or, you know, sort of the takeover by big business for the industry, or how much public health is included in conversations about reform going forward. Those are probably going to have much different purchase, you know, with a different, you know, legislatures that are inevitably going to have to respond no matter what. There was a question in the Q&A, you know, can't the legislature fix what's there? And the answer is sometimes, depend on how the ballot's written, depend on how the state law operates, but that itself has always been a big part of the kind of inside baseball here is, what does the initiative try to take off the table for a state legislature, and what does it kind of necessarily punt? And your point, Burrel, especially about, you know, do you create a board? What does that board look like to do regulation here? What's their power and what are their limitations? Those are all fascinating issues that we'll continue to watch in those states going forward. Some of the earlier comments kind of remind me, and is you know, part of this story of how the ballot initiatives have been so iterative, right? So your point, Tamara, especially about how, you know, even a loss leads reformers and others to kind of take a new perspective on how to move this forward. And of course, you know, that's the backstory. You know, you mentioned California passing medical marijuana in 96 is sort of the first big one. I sometimes think about California turning down the first full legalization initiative in 2010, in part because the medical industry said, well, we don't like this. This changes our business model and we're going to vote against it. And then Colorado, Washington, figured out, oh, we've got to include the medical industry as kind of first in line for the new industry. And that seems to have shaped, a decade of reform efforts going forward. And I emphasize that point, not only because I think whatever happens this cycle, there'll be lessons learned and a new wave of efforts as we build towards 2024. I know here in Ohio, there's talk of a possible 23 campaign because it tried to get on the ballot for 22, but got pushed off for technical reasons. We'll see whether it goes forward in 23 or 24, but I would bet that every state that has the possibility for initiative will be thinking about it, certainly as we continue to move forward with these trends. But then that leads me to wonder about sort of the broader drug policy trends and how iterative that is. And especially, I know, Tamar, you've worked in Colorado, I think, to do a psychedelics initiative. Oregon, of course, notably in 2020, passed both a psychedelics initiative and a decriminalization initiative. Perhaps because it's way out there west in Oregon, it doesn't get a lot of national press about how things are going. But what little I can tell is it's either going slowly or not so well. And maybe that explains why we've not seen, at least this cycle, other states, even very, very blue states, other than maybe Colorado with psychedelics, kind of embracing broader drug policy reform on the ballot. Is that also maybe a dollars and cents issue, right? That there's not the same kind of economic fuel for decriminalization or even for psychedelics, given the path that's going in. And so I'd love to get sort of thoughts of, especially Tamar, if you feel comfortable talking about your work in Colorado on a psychedelics initiative and whether and how what we've been talking about for cannabis is inevitably, but maybe very slowly, going to iterate its way into other initiative efforts, or is there a unique limit to the ability for this kind of wave of campaigns to carry over to other drugs?
Yeah, those are interesting points. First I wanted to, can I make two quick points on things that were said before, and then I'll move on to that. First, I just wanted to point out one of the things with South Dakota, and this is how marijuana has also messed up the ballot initiative process. So South Dakota won in 2020 with a directive to set up a whole regulatory structure and empowering an agency. And then the Supreme Court threw it out and said it violated the single subject. You couldn't do all those things. So now it's had to come back with this very simple piece or whatever. So it's sort of the battle of the people versus I guess the powers that be on it.
And I saw one of the questions in the Q&A about single subject. Is your sense that courts are being by the book and just saying sorry, or is there a special kind of anti-marijuana sentiment among the courts that say we're really going to fly spec this stuff because we don't like it?
Yeah.
In a particularly significant way.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate the value of the single subject. Like sometimes you're faced with a ballot initiative, like, well, I like this part, but I don't like this part. Like, what do I have to vote on the whole thing together? It's like the idea that you can't log roll, but it has in certain contexts been used very politically. And I think the most egregious example of that is the Nebraska Supreme Court that basically wrote a decision on its medical initiative that's like literally impossible to apply to something that could be successful. And that because like a team of like really smart lawyers sat down afterwards and said, how would we possibly write an initiative that comports to this? And then came away and said, this is almost impossible. It's very contorted. They came out with another single subject decision on the context of the same day that completely conflicted with what they came out. So it's very much used as a tool that we don't want to amend our state constitution to put medical cannabis in there. Like we're going to kick it. So I think that it can be used very politically. And then I want to also make a quick point about the Prop 19 California loss in 2010 that I think is interesting. And you had alluded, like part of it was about medical cannabis. A lot of it, though, was also a post-election evaluation of what do you need to get those middle voters, like the people who are not interested in cannabis, don't like cannabis at all, but need to be convinced to vote for this. And I think you then see in 2012 and 2014 and those narratives around that election that's appealing very much to like the mom of teenagers and why regulation is safer are coming out of lessons learned exactly from that Prop 19 campaign in California and what kind of messages you need politically to win. But in terms of this next election cycle, is true. I mean, I think, there's a lot of complicated factors that go into whether there's going to be a ballot initiative. One obviously is funding. Like a question about if you want to put a ballot initiative on in California, which is maybe ripe for all sorts of reforms, you need to figure out how you're going to raise $20 or $30 million to do it, which is incredibly challenging. So, where would it be? Is there the funding there to do it? Do we need more time to see how things play out in Oregon? It's some of the issues are more complicated. I mean, cannabis has always had this strange marrying of like social justice and creating a huge economic industry that comes to voters with, we're going to make all this money for the state. Isn't that great? So even if they're not so psyched about cannabis regulation, they're like, I do want more funding for the schools. Whereas all drug decriminalization and even the psychedelics work is not like a money maker for the state. And so some of those hesitant voters, but in other ways are very incredibly popular among voters in terms of wanting to like shift the policy and the policy outcomes. But the messages around it are really different in the coalition to build it. Oregon on the psychedelics, it hasn't even opened up and been implemented yet. So there's not sort of that as an example, but we do have the initiative on the ballot in Colorado. And I think the decriminalization in Oregon, it's just, it was probably too soon the next 2 years to pull together the funding and an initiative in the right state for the right ballot, but we'll probably see something in 24, I think, the next iteration of what Oregon looked like there.
Great. Other thoughts from other panelists about sort of other drugs, or at least where this carries over?
I mean, we had the paper that came out in 2019 looking at the effects, the benefits of psilocybin, right? And so I think states are still trying to figure out, like in addition to the economic benefits, they're still trying to figure out what this is and whether or not there's going to be a benefit, right? So we have, what is it, Texas, Utah, Washington, Maryland, all like putting money towards funding these issues and trying to understand, like, not only will there be an economic benefit, but specifically, who is this helping and what can it help, right? Is it going to help veterans coming home with PTSD, right? Or are there other medicines that people have tried that don't necessarily help? So like we're in the stage where, yes, tomorrow, we're too soon, right? We're still trying to figure out what's going to work and what's not. So like maybe Oregon was ahead of the curve, but I think that if we are to see something, we might see a similar first adoption pattern, right? First adopter pattern where like Oregon, Washington, maybe California would be the first to sort of fall to these things. But it's interesting to see that there are a bunch of task force sort of like trying to tackle this issue early on. But yeah, those are my thoughts.
I'll just add one quick thing, and then I have an interesting, very short story to add to this. So one thing that I think will hinder short-term sort of the extension of the marijuana legalization to other drugs as a model is the comparative lack of familiarity for a lot of the populace. So marijuana, a whole lot of people have tried it at some point, or their friends have tried it. They're generally familiar with it. And so they have some sense, oh, my friend in high school used to do that, and all he did was sit and listen to Pink Floyd. He didn't go out and do anything, negative, to be a little flippant about it. But they don't have that innate familiarity for some of these other drugs. They're just used by a significant portion of the population, more than a lot of people think, but much smaller than people who have experience with cannabis. And just because Tamar made such a great point about it, I couldn't resist making a note of this, that we keep talking about, California as the first. We could be talking about Arizona as the first, but for the really strange history of what happened with Arizona in the 90s and legalization, which is also the source of some of the weirdness in Arizona system, why it's so locked in now, which is Arizona voters passed a legalization initiative. The legislature went in and essentially neutered it. The voters responded by removing the power of the legislature to change voter initiatives. And now on this year's ballot, there is both a single subject limitation initiative for future initiatives, and one to give the legislature power to amend initiatives if a court has declared something unconstitutional in part of it. So it's just a very strange pattern that is played out here, but all to, to the points that Burrel and Tamara have made about how interesting this process is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, adding an extra layer of either analysis or just speculation, because this is the one that, obviously the amount of conversation about the possibility for federal reform. And we've obviously seen a number of bills, more than a few have actually made it through the House of Representatives in the last couple of years. And the Senate seems to be the sticking point, but it seemed like, and maybe this is sort of, poor recollection, but we were 5 or 6 years ago, there was very much the sense of, well, once enough states legalize medical, then there'll be enough senators in those states that they've got to vote for reform at the federal level, because, how could they vote against sort of the interest of their citizens? Or often some of these cases, they've been even red states that have legalized legislatively. That happened here in Ohio, although under the threat of a possible ballot initiative, and there are other examples of that as well. And we're up to, depending on how you want to count, 38, 39 states that, whatever your head count is, that's at least 70 plus senators that ought to be enough to get something forward against the backdrop of blanket federal prohibition. And yet things haven't moved, and probably everyone here is familiar with kind of how that's kind of locked up. Is there any hope, any belief, any vision for this cycle, or maybe we got to think about 2024, where the ballot initiatives at the state level help break up that logjam? Or is there, have we just sort of basically seen kind of the limit for state reform prodding federal legislators from changing course? Or is it even a story, and this is certainly what I've speculated about, that there's at least some in the industry, some in the reform community that's comfortable with the dichotomy we now have with state level reforms and federal prohibition. And so, there's at least enough of a sort of strange set of coalitions that even if they'd like federal reform, they're not going to push for it that hard. That in turn provides cover for legislators at the federal level to not be that worried politically about being oppositional to reform. Just love your take on, whether you think this cycle could change things again, especially, if we're talking about 4 red states. Let's imagine, I've speculated at least a little bit, if all 4 states were to fully legalize and the margins were surprisingly large. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but if they all went 60-40, there certainly would be, I think, in the advocacy community, look, even in red states, this has, supermajority support. Enough is enough already. What's your sense of the way in which this could echo into the federal debate? And of course, there's both a lame duck part of that conversation while Democrats are control, and then there's the, if you believe the polls, which I think are mostly believable, that at least one house, maybe both houses of Congress, will be in Republican control, come the next Congress. Do you see any echoes in either way that could lead those who I suspect are eager for some kind of federal reform to be hopeful that we'll get a change through these initiatives?
I mean, I'll jump in. I mean, I believe that the best thing we can do to push towards federal reform is to keep legalizing in states and in these red states. Like, I think that's a more effective. I don't know how soon that happens, but I think that's the most effective approach to get there versus just lobbying federally. So I think it will be significant, especially if there's significant industries in these states. I mean, Oklahoma has a very big medical cannabis system, and it potentially, I think, has big impact if these states legalize. I don't think that there's like broad support for keeping the status quo, but I think there's now a lot of caution about what legalization looks like. And if it's done wrong, it could potentially be very damaging to a number of the state law programs that have been very intentional in trying to build up equity and equitable programs and implement things. There's a reason why, Philip Morris and Amazon and those things are not in the cannabis industry. And I imagine it's because they have a general counsel that says you can't violate federal law and risk going to prison for the rest of your life at this point. When that changes and there's interstate commerce, and if large corporations are allowed to come in, that will really undo so much work that's happened in states to build social equity programs that I think now there's just, and Shailene Title has been working with you as one of the most thought leaders on this. I think that there's ways that could be very, very damaging. So it's not, the reform has to happen because there's so many federal collateral consequences, at least, that are so harmful for individuals and their liberties. But how we do it really matters a lot. And a lot, like the same like people who said I don't support, I always supported marijuana legalization, but actually I don't support this Ohio thing in 2015. I think there's a lot of versions where people are like, hey, actually I don't support that, even though I want there to be federal legalization, federal reform.
Totally agree on that. And I think to some extent, the waiting on the federal legalization, while it has a lot of problems, one benefit to it being kind of delayed out here is that we are getting a sense of what is working in states and what is not. But I will eventually get there. I do think. I'm not terribly optimistic about how soon that will happen. One of the things that I think keeps a cap on that, oh, well, there's like 70 legislators or 70 senators from states that are legalizing or something along those lines, is that there's just not a lot of single issue voters here. Nobody is going to win or lose a Senate race solely on this. Contrast that to something that's a real flashpoint like abortion. There might be something there where just, I will not vote for this person, or I will vote for this person exclusively based on their position on that issue. We don't have that here. And so it doesn't have the same kind of political push, in my view, for that reason.
I think what's going to be really telling is what happens if it happens in Florida in 2024, right? Another big state that could bring in tremendous amount of revenue, a red state, reddish state, and that would probably provide some purchase for the federal government in terms of how to balance sort of left-leaning states' approaches to the issue, as well as what these right-leaning states are doing. And we can sort of like meet in the middle somewhere and develop some kind of. But I think we are sort of following the trajectory of prohibition in that, like, once you get enough, then the state will follow, and then once you get enough states, then the federal government will follow. But I think the waiting period here is super important because we need to know what's like all you have echoed, what's working and what's not, and how do we incorporate an equity piece into this in addition to the sort of satisfy swing voters in right leaning areas. Yeah, I for me that's the one to watch is Florida.
Great, and I want to turn to 2024 in a minute, but there's a great question in the Q&A that I didn't bring up earlier that I'd love your thoughts on or comments. My sense is a lot of the ballot initiatives have gone with a very strong commitment to local control, right? Allowing a locality to refuse to have stores, to refuse to have grows, whatever they want, that they get to do that. And my colleague Rob Mikos has written, and others, about that. That's probably not good policy, or to the extent it's good policy, it's only if you kind of have a really strong commitment to a certain form of local democracy. But even there, it can often be, I think the question highlighted, in jurisdictions that have locally voted, sometimes even overwhelmingly, for legalization at a statewide ballot initiative, the local legislature, the local town council, whatever it is, will vote against allowing stores in their community. And I'm wondering, is it just that's included as a matter of good politics and has been essential for good politics, but it's bad policy, or your own sort of take on whether there's an argument for, kind of why local control is not only important for voter interest and voter support, but also, values in some senses, reinforces that voter control doesn't just extend to the statewide conversation, but, each and individual locality should have a right, should have an opportunity to kind of voice itself, whether that's by their own ballot vote or having their local representatives decide on what the locality will be doing on these issues.
I can jump in really quickly just on the reasons why there's local control in all the initiatives. It's politics. I think it's two things. It's definitely politics because there's been very few losses, but there's been very little opposition money against any of the initiatives. And when there was in Arizona in 2012, it lost, or 2016, it lost. So yes, like it'd be difficult to run the ballot initiative if there was, in some states, California, the cities and counties are incredibly powerful. And if they would come out against it and fund opposition, it'd be difficult. On the back end, a lot of the challenges against the laws have been brought by localities. This is preempted by federal law because they don't want it in their jurisdiction. So if the law doesn't allow them to ban, they'll challenge it in court and delay it or attempt to undo it, which I think is a significant risk. And on the policy question, I don't like the complete bans. I mean, I think they're working to undermine the implementation of the law, and in some states like California really have undermined the ability to implement it. At the same time, I do like the idea of local communities being able to help craft what works for them. And the strong local control in California has also led to localities, the progressive localities like San Francisco and Oakland, Sacramento, devising licensing structures that help give the licenses to the entities they want. So it can work to allow localities, I think, to be very creative on the local level in terms of how to repair harm and things like that when it's used the right way. But the complete bans are very problematic.
Agree on a lot of that. I as a public health person, I'm very much of two minds on local control. It's often used very effectively to sort of combat some things, especially in the tobacco realm. But I do worry that in cannabis policy, particularly, it tends to just devolve into NIMBYism. And then one of my main worries there is that it shunts all of the businesses into the communities that can't organize to stop them. And that's a historical pattern that we do not want to repeat, but we're probably going to if we allow these localities to have that level of control. To the point in the question about, well, what could we do to address that? I mean, I think there's room for some compromise here of sort of setting a floor for what local jurisdictions need to allow and setting a, sort of an open ceiling on, well, you can prohibit this. I think one issue I've been thinking about lately is delivery as sort of a way through some of this thicket, which is if you don't want brick and mortar shops because you don't want to see the ads and you don't want kids to see it on their way walking to school or whatnot, well, let people get it another way that doesn't involve the same level of in your face retail shop. So I think there's some ways through this, but it's just a little bit complicated. But I do share Tamar's concerns about allowing localities to sort of completely undermine, even against their own interests in a lot of instances.
Do we know anything about the consequences of this type of NIMBYism, right? Like, do we know if localities have implemented bans and whether or not, I'm a narratives person, so I'm wondering if pushing brick and mortars to maybe underserved areas sort of feeds the narrative about like crime in these communities and things like that, and whether or not it's going to end up even more like doubly damaging for these communities rather than just like the external spillover effects. I'm not too versed on that stuff, so
yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that point, Burrel, because I remember, gosh, this is going back to 2015, 2016, that I think it was the Denver Post did a big, long segment kind of highlighting how all the cannabis storefronts were in minority neighborhoods and all the warehouses were being bought out because that was where it was sort of cheaper space. And, look, this was supposed to be a social equity thing, but, it's the minority neighborhoods that, have this in their face in a kind of way that's there. I think they were talking, it was partially a function of economics, but also was, again, it's a private industry too, right? If there are certain warehouse spaces or industrial parks that just, I'm not going to sell space to certain kind of industries, that ends up having its own leverage to where this ends up. And so it's, again, this is why I enjoy talking to smart people about this. It brings up so many interesting issues, and we're running short of time, but we have kind of a last minute for kind of last thoughts, although I particularly want to kind of emphasize the last thoughts looking forward, whether it's looking forward to 2024 or beyond, both with the ballot initiative story, but, the broader policy debate, I'll throw in, Burrell brought up Florida. I will certainly be watching Florida and look for any excuse to, especially in the winter here in Ohio, to go down and do some field research with what's going on down there. But also I mentioned Ohio because I think it's gonna be interesting to watch whether we actually go forward, with the 2023 campaign that's sort of poised to have possibilities, but the history has always been to try to do it on the even years. In fact, again, notable that Ohio's loss was in an off year, and that was part of the conversation that I think drove it to the ballot in that funny way, the hope that there wouldn't be much opposition and only people who were supportive would show up to vote. But that's, again, for me, watching both what 2024 may bring and how that will interplay with the kind of federal stories we were talking about earlier. Love to hear any final thoughts of what they're watching, what they're looking forward to, where there'll be refreshing results on election night, or any variation on those themes, combined with, of course, me thanking you so much for your time and all the participants who signed up to listen to what you all had to say.
I'm sort of interested in saying kind of what Tamara alluded to earlier, I think it was you, Tamara, about communities and changes to rules surrounding direct democracy, right? We have an idea about the effect that this process can have, but I'm interested to know maybe in more in places where the legislature doesn't really necessarily have a lot of power, whether or not they're willing to change these rules to sort of comport to their own ideas about what should be happening in the various jurisdictions or states. So it's sort of a backlash story that I'm super interested in. And this extends beyond the effects of this particular issue.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm very interested in looking at, for cannabis, I'm just focused on this election in March because Oklahoma is not going to be on the ballot March 7th, which is a special election with just that on the ballot. So a lot of these questions about whether it actually drives turnout or not, we'll see. I'm interested on the direct democracy question. I think in the next couple of years, what happens around abortion and initiatives in states related to that is going to be such political area where I think we've already seen like things not being put on the ballot once they've qualified, and what effect that has on direct democracy laws and state Supreme Courts and state legislatures.
I don't have too much to add to those thoughts. I'll admit, cannabis is not top of mind for me in this election. There's so much else going on that gives me so much pause and concern that it'll play out there too, but yeah, I have some other concerns about the health of democracy.
Well, I'll use that as an excuse to kind of suggest, if not actually have the receipts to prove it, that I do think the ballot initiatives, in this space particularly, have gotten people tuned into, hey, I can make a policy change just by showing up and voting, right? And that, it's funny because even before modern marijuana reforms, I've been a fan of direct democracy, in part because I think it's one way for people to feel a lot more invested. They vote for a particular thing and that particular thing happens, rather than sort of have all of the sort of stalking horse realities that seem to go behind the representative process. And so I think there can be healthy ways. And that's why I'm so grateful to have all of you to give us perspective on kind of what we've learned and what more there is to learn, both in the cannabis space and in the direct democracy space. So I'll do the round of applause and hope the other folks still listening in will do the same, and just say, perhaps we'll get back together before too long to see what we did learn from this cycle and what more there is to look ahead to. So with that, I will call us concluded for the day, and again say thanks to everybody both at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center and helping to put all this together. Please check out our website if you're interested in these sets of topics or others. And thanks again to our panelists for informing us today and helping us at a time that was early for them have a fully informed day. So thanks again, and I really appreciate it, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.